The screen of my tablet glowed in the quiet of my Sunday morning. There was my daughter, Brenda, smiling in a beautiful cream-colored dress, standing next to her husband, Todd. With them were his parents, looking pleased as punch. In Brenda's arms was a baby, a grandson I didn't even know existed. I leaned in, my coffee forgotten, and read the caption below the professionally shot photo. "Welcoming baby Theodore into the world. Our little family is finally complete." That one word, complete, sucked all the air out of the room. It wasn't an announcement. It was a verdict. A judgment that I was no longer a part of the equation. I had been erased. But that perfect family portrait wasn't an accident. It was the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. That perfect family portrait wasn't an accident. It was the final crack in a foundation that had been crumbling for years. A crumbling I had tried to patch with sacrifice, with patience, and with a love so blinding I refused to see the rot spreading right beneath my feet. My thumb hovered over Brenda's number, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I finally pressed call. She answered on the third ring, her voice as breezy and bright as a morning news anchor. "Hey, Mom. What's up?" "Brenda," I said, my own voice sounding foreign and thin. I saw the picture on the internet." There was a tiny pause, a flicker of something annoyance, maybe before the brightness snapped back on. "Oh, that. Gosh, it's been a whirlwind. We were going to call you this week, I swear." "You had a baby," I whispered, the words feeling like pebbles in my mouth. "I have a grandson." "Isn't he just the cutest?" "We named him Theodore," she chirped. "Listen, Mom, it was all just so last minute. Meredith Todd's mother insisted on a very small private christening. You know how she is about tradition. We didn't want to overwhelm Theo with a big crowd." A big crowd. I was a crowd, his only living grandmother, so I wouldn't have been invited anyway. "Oh, don't be like that," she sighed, the manufactured patience wearing thin. "It was just a small, private family thing." Before I could respond, a different voice, smooth and condescending, came on the line. It was Todd. "Eleanor," he said, not even bothering with a hello. "Brenda's right. It was a family affair. Look, we're a little swamped right now, but we'll pencil you in for a visit sometime next week, okay? We'll talk then." And then, the line went dead. Pencil me in. I lowered the phone, the silence of my small Cleveland home pressing in on me. They would pencil me in. His voice, so dismissive and slick, sent a chill down my spine and dragged a memory up from the depths, a time when my daughter's voice hadn't been breezy, and a phone call from her was a matter of life and death. It was 15 years ago, on a Tuesday so cold the air felt like glass. I was standing in Mac's Books, a little hole in the wall shop downtown that smelled of vanilla and aging paper. It was my sanctuary. And in my hands, protected by white cotton gloves, was my holy grail. A first American edition of To Kill a Mockingbird, signed by Harper Lee herself. The spine was perfect, the jacket crisp. It had taken me 20 years of searching, of saving every spare dollar from my librarian's salary, of brown bagging my lunch and turning down vacations. It was more than a book. It was my one selfish, beautiful dream. It cost $7,000, a fortune I had carefully tucked away. As I stood at the counter, ready to finally make it mine, my flip phone buzzed. It was Brenda, sobbing. "Mom, oh my God, I don't know what to do." Her first real apartment, the one she and Todd had found, had fallen through. The landlord wanted first, last, and a security deposit, a sum they just didn't have. "We'll be homeless, Mom," she wailed, her panic raw and real. I looked at the book in my hands, the dream I could finally hold. Then I thought of my daughter, my only child, afraid and adrift. There was no choice. There was never a choice when it came to Brenda. "Don't you worry, honey," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I'll take care of it." I slid the book back across the counter to a disappointed Mr. McIntyre. "The books can wait," I told him. An hour later, $7,000 was in Brenda's bank account. She never asked where the money came from. Now, sitting in my quiet kitchen, the memory of that sacrifice felt like acid. I had given up my dream for her future, and she had given me a photo caption, "Family complete." The crumbling had been happening for a while. The foundation had been shaky ever since Todd came into the picture. I remembered a visit 6 months ago. He'd walked into my living room, his suit a little too tight, his watch a little too big, and scanned my floor-to-ceiling bookshelves with a smirk. My books are my life's work, a collection curated over 50 years. He saw them as clutter. "You know, Eleanor," he'd said, running a finger over a leather-bound Dickens and then wiping it on his pants. "We should really get these dusty old things appraised for insurance, just to be responsible." He was a wealth advisor, a title that seemed to mean telling other people what to do with their money. "To be honest," he'd continued, leaning in conspiratorially, "physical assets like these are a real drag on a modern portfolio. Too illiquid." He said illiquid like it was a dirty word. Brenda just stood by the doorway, examining her nails, her silence a clear endorsement. That was the preamble. The main event came a week after the christening photo, when they made their penciled-in visit. They sat stiffly on my sofa, refusing my offer of iced tea. After 5 minutes of awkward silence, Brenda cleared her throat. "Mom," she began, "Todd and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future. For Theo, we want to buy a house." Todd cut in, taking over. "A real house. Better school district. You understand, the market is just insane right now." I nodded slowly, unsure where this was going. "This house," he said, gesturing around my home of 40 years, "the home I brought Brenda home to from the hospital, is really too big for you now. All the upkeep, the property taxes." He shook his head with mock concern. "We were thinking, the most logical thing would be for you to sell. You could move into a nice senior apartment, something more manageable. The one we looked at over in Parma is perfectly adequate." I stared at him. He had already scouted locations for my exile. Brenda finally spoke, refusing to meet my eyes. "The proceeds from the sale could be an early inheritance for us, Mom. It would be the perfect down payment for our new house, for your grandson's future." There it was, the demand, wrapped in a flimsy blanket of concern. They wanted me to liquidate my life so they could upgrade theirs. They didn't see a home filled with memories. They saw a financial asset. They didn't see me. They saw an obstacle. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. Something inside me went very cold and very still. I folded my hands in my lap, my knuckles white. All the years of sacrifice, the book I put back on the shelf, the PTA meetings I never missed, the scraped knees I bandaged, all of it coalesced into a single hard point of clarity. They had appraised my worth and found it lacking. Now, it was my turn to make an appraisal. They saw a quiet old woman in a house full of dusty, worthless books. They had no idea they were sitting in a library of ammunition, and I, the quiet librarian, was about to check it all out. That night, I didn't sleep, but I didn't toss and turn either. I lay in bed, the moonlight striping the floor, and I planned. There were no tears, no rage-fueled fantasies of screaming at my daughter. The emotional part of me, the soft, forgiving mother, had been cauterized. What was left was the librarian, methodical, patient, with an encyclopedic knowledge of value and a deep respect for the power of the written word. The next morning, I didn't call a real estate agent. I didn't call a lawyer. I made myself a strong cup of black coffee, took a seat at my old oak desk, and pulled out a worn, leather-bound address book. It wasn't filled with numbers for plumbers or neighbors. It held the private contacts of a life they knew nothing about: book dealers in London, archivists at the Library of Congress, and academics I'd corresponded with for decades. My finger, wrinkled but steady, ran down a page until it found the name I was looking for: Dr. Alistair Finch, the Grolier Club, New York City. Alistair and I had been friends for 30 years, ever since we'd gotten into a bidding war over a rare piece of correspondence from Walt Whitman. He won, but he respected the fight I put up. I dialed his direct line. He answered with his usual brisk British accented tone. "Finch." "Alistair," I said calmly. "It's Eleanor Vance." The briskness vanished, replaced by warmth. "Eleanor, my dear, it's been too long. Is everything all right? I haven't seen you at any of the antiquarian shows." "Everything is about to be," I said. "Alistair, I need an introduction. The best specialist in 19th century American literature at Sotheby's. I think it's time to liquidate." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. He knew exactly what that meant. He knew my collection wasn't just a hobby. For a moment, there was only a stunned silence. "My God, Eleanor," he finally said, his voice low with awe. "Are you certain? The whole collection?" "The whole collection," I confirmed. "I'm starting a new chapter, and I've decided to write it myself." "Then you shall have the grandest first edition imaginable," he said, his voice now buzzing with energy. "I'll make the call this morning. They'll be on a plane to Cleveland by tomorrow." The days that followed were a blur of quiet, focused work. I didn't feel sadness as I began to catalog the treasures that lined my walls. I felt a sense of profound purpose. My hands, which had changed countless diapers and baked 1,000 birthday cakes, now moved with the practiced grace of a surgeon. I handled a first edition of Moby Dick, its blue-gray cloth binding cool to the touch, and remembered buying it at a dusty garage sale in the 70 seconds for $0.25. The owner thought it was just an old book. I knew what it was. I ran my fingers over the embossed gold on a collection of Edgar Allan Poe's tales from 1845. I thought of Todd, with his slick talk of a modern portfolio. He dealt in pixels on a screen, in abstract numbers that rose and fell with the market's whims. I dealt in things that had survived wars and fires, and the simple decay of time. I dealt in history, intangible beauty, and it turned out my portfolio was far more robust than his. The specialist from Sotheby's, a young, sharp woman named Miss Davies, arrived exactly as Alistair had promised. She walked into my living room and simply stopped, her professional composure melting away into pure reverence. She didn't see clutter. She saw what I saw. For 2 days we worked together, our conversation a quiet murmur of edition points, provenance, and binder's marks. "Mrs. Vance," she said at one point, looking up from a fragile copy of The Scarlet Letter, "this isn't just a collection. It's a cultural landmark. You were a librarian," your friend said. "For 40 years. I replied, "at Jefferson Middle School." She shook her head in disbelief. All this time, one of the finest collections of American literature was being curated in a suburb in Ohio by a middle school librarian. It's the best kind of story. On the final day, as we were making the last entries, my hand brushed against a familiar spine. It was a first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird. It wasn't the signed copy I had sacrificed for Brenda all those years ago. That one was gone forever. This was a replacement I had found years later, a very good copy, but unsigned. I pulled it from the shelf, the weight of it familiar in my hands. The $7,000 I had given Brenda was the money that had allowed Todd to become a permanent fixture in her life. It was the seed money for the life that had eventually pushed me out. The irony was so thick I could taste it. That first book cost me my dream. This one was about to buy me my freedom. Miss Davies looked at the book and smiled. "A beautiful copy, the centerpiece of any collection." "It's the book that started it all," I said, and the double meaning was for me alone. A week later, a team of art handlers arrived. They packed my life's work into climate-controlled crates with a reverence that bordered on religious. I watched them load the last box onto the truck, the space on the shelves behind it a ghostly white. The house felt vast and empty, but not lonely. It felt light. For the first time in years, there was room to breathe. That evening, I got a call from Brenda. "Hey, Mom," she said, her voice casual. "Todd and I were just looking at some houses online, and wow, you would not believe the prices. Anyway, we were wondering if you'd had any more thoughts on our little idea." I looked at the pale rectangles on my walls where my books used to be. I thought of the glossy catalogs being designed in New York, the ones that would soon land on the coffee tables of collectors around the world. "I have, actually," I said, my voice serene. "I've decided to make some moves. You could say I'm liquidating some assets." "That's great, Mom," she said, excitement coloring her voice. "We knew you'd see it our way." "Yes," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. "I'm sure you did." The trap was set. The auction was in 3 weeks. All I had to do was wait for the news to find them. For 21 days, I lived in the echo of my own house. I packed my clothes, my photographs, and the few pieces of furniture that truly mattered. Movers came and put it all in storage. I sold the house in a quiet, private deal to a young family who loved the big backyard. All the while, Brenda and Todd were busy looking at listings on Zillow, sending me links to 4-bedroom houses with finished basements, completely oblivious. They thought my silence was compliance. They had no idea it was the quiet before the storm. On the day of the auction, I was in a hotel room in downtown Cleveland, looking out over the city. I didn't need to be in New York. I knew how it would go. At precisely 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Sotheby's with the subject line, "Your auction is now live, the Eleanor Vance collection." I opened the link. It was beautiful, a glossy, interactive catalog featuring my books as if they were crown jewels. There was a professionally written biography, painting me as a discerning and quiet force in the world of literary collecting. There was a photo of me, taken by the Sotheby's photographer, where I looked not like a forgotten old woman, but like a scholar, poised, knowledgeable, powerful. I took a sip of my tea. Then with a steady hand I forwarded the email. I sent it to one person, Todd. I didn't add a subject line of my own. I just wrote a single sentence in the body of the email. Todd, since you're a wealth advisor, I thought you might find this portfolio of illiquid assets interesting. I hit send. Then I turned my phone off. I can only imagine the scene. He would have been in his office, probably telling some poor soul to diversify their bonds. He'd see an email from me and open it with an annoyed sigh, expecting another question about his plans for my house. And then he would have seen it. First, my name connected to the word Sotheby's, the initial confusion. Then, the images of my dusty old books, each one with an estimated value listed below it that was more than his yearly salary. The scarlet letter, estimate, $50,000, $70,000. Moby Dick, estimate, $80,000, $120,000, and on, page after page of a fortune he had dismissed as clutter. I imagined the blood draining from his face, the buzzing of his office fading to a dull roar in his ears, his world, built on the perception of financial savvy, collapsing in on itself. The final crushing blow would have been the auction's total low-end estimate, a number with 7 figures. The phone call to Brenda would have been frantic, nonsensical. I picture her on the other end, annoyed at being interrupted during little Theo's nap. "What are you talking about, Todd? Slow down." "The books, Brenda. The damn books. They're worth millions. Your mother, she's selling everything." They raced to my house, breaking every speed limit. They must have felt a cold dread creep over them when they saw it first, the bright, cheerful sold sign staked into the front lawn like a dagger. Their key still worked in the lock. They would have burst inside, calling my name. But the only answer was the echo of their own panicked voices in the empty rooms. They would have run into the living room, the heart of my home, and stopped dead. The shelves were still there, but they were barren. Just pale, ghostly rectangles on the wallpaper where my books had stood for half a century. A lifetime of history, of value, of power gone. The assets had been liquidated. They would have searched the house like mad, looking for a note, a clue, anything. Finally, in the center of the kitchen counter, they would have found it. A single, small, moving box with Brenda's name written on it in my neat librarian script. I imagined the flicker of hope in their eyes. Maybe it was legal documents, bank statements, a check. Brenda's hands would have trembled as she tore it open. Inside, there was no fortune. There was only the past, her high school yearbooks, a faded blue ribbon she won in a 4th grade spelling bee, a box of crayons, and on top of it all, a simple cream-colored greeting card. She would have opened it, her breath catching in her throat. A single small key was taped to the inside, the key to a storage unit a few miles away. Below it, I had written just 2 sentences. "Brenda, I have left you exactly what you have earned from me. The memories, everything else, I earned for myself." That would have been the moment of absolute devastation. The realization that it was all gone. Not just the money, but any claim they thought they had on me. Brenda probably sank to the floor, the useless yearbooks spread around her. But Todd's reaction would have been different. He would have felt the cold, hard terror of a professional con man who has just realized he was the biggest mark of all. His reputation as a financial guru, the man who could spot an opportunity, was destroyed. How do you explain to your wealthy clients and your even wealthier parents that you stood in a room worth millions and advised its owner to sell it for pennies on the dollar? I turned my phone back on that evening. There were 17 missed calls from Brenda and 10 from Todd. There were dozens of texts, a cascade of panic, fury, and then, finally, pleading. I deleted them all without reading a single one. I had already heard everything they had to say. Deleting those 17 missed calls wasn't an act of anger, it was an act of housekeeping, like clearing out old junk mail. It was the simple, quiet task of tidying up a life that was no longer mine. My new life began with the scent of jasmine and salt water. I bought a small, historic house in Charleston, South Carolina, a city as elegant and resilient as the women who had lived there for centuries. It had a little walled garden, a piazza for sitting in the shade, and tall windows that let the golden coastal light spill across the heart pine floors. After a lifetime of Cleveland gray, the sunshine felt like a form of grace. The first thing I bought for my new home was a single, simple bookshelf. For weeks, it remained empty. I had freed myself from the weight of my collection, and I was in no hurry to fill the void. Instead, I walked. I walked along the Battery, watching the dolphins play in the harbor. I wandered through the stalls of the city market, buying sweetgrass baskets I didn't need, just because they were beautiful. I found new bookstores, tiny shops where the owners knew their customers by name. I started buying books again, but this time, they were different. I bought dog-eared paperbacks to read in my garden. I bought modern poetry that made no sense but felt good to read aloud. I was building a new library, one based not on monetary value, but on joy. I was thinking about my future, but for the first time, it was my own. It wasn't about setting something aside for Brenda or ensuring there was a nest egg for emergencies. It was about deciding what color to paint the front door, or whether to plant camellias or gardenias by the gate. These small, simple choices felt more liberating than any multi-million-dollar auction ever could. About 2 months after I moved, a letter arrived. It was on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the kind of stationery that costs $5 a sheet. The postmark was from Beacon Hill, Boston. It was from Meredith, Todd's mother. My first instinct was to throw it away, to refuse any entry point back into that world. But curiosity, the librarian's oldest friend, got the better of me. I sat in my garden, the afternoon sun warming my face, and opened it. The handwriting was a perfect, slanted cursive. It was not a letter asking for reconciliation or money. It was, to my astonishment, a letter of surrender. "Dear Eleanor," it began, "I have encouraged my son to begin divorce proceedings. A man who fails to recognize a fortune standing in plain sight is not a man I trust to manage my family's legacy. He and your daughter saw you as a resource to be managed, and in my own way, I was no better. I judged you by your quiet life and your simple home. I saw a suburban widow, not a titan of industry living in plain sight. You built an empire in silence, funded by a discipline I can only admire. I have never been more wrong about a person in my life, or more impressed. I do not ask for your forgiveness, as I do not deserve it. I am writing only to offer my profound, unvarnished respect." I folded the letter and placed it on the small table beside me. There was no sense of triumph, no desire to gloat. There was only a quiet, profound sense of validation. The person who had seen me as the least had finally been forced to see me as the most. It was an ending to that chapter I never knew I needed. My life settled into a peaceful rhythm. I made friends, other women who had lived full lives and had stories of their own. We went to plays, we tried new restaurants, we took art classes. I was no longer just Brenda's mother. I was Eleanor, the woman who knew a surprising amount about Civil War history, who made a killer lemon meringue pie, and who could be counted on for a walk on the beach at sunset. One evening, a notification popped up on my tablet. It was a video message from Brenda. My finger hovered over the delete button, my old instinct of housekeeping kicking in, but I paused. I owed it to the woman I had become to face this last ghost without flinching. I pressed play. Brenda's face filled the screen. She was in a dimly lit room, her hair a mess, dark circles under her eyes. The polished, confident woman was gone, replaced by someone who looked lost. And in her arms, sleeping soundly, was my grandson Theodore. "Mom," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He has your eyes. I didn't realize it until now. Todd left. He said I was a bad investment." She let out a choked, bitter laugh. He was right. I invested in the wrong things, appearance, status, what Meredith wanted, and I threw away the only thing that was ever real. I threw you away. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I miss you." I watched the video twice. I looked at the beautiful, innocent face of my grandson, and I felt a pang of love so deep it ached. I felt a sorrow for the daughter I had raised and the woman she had failed to become. But underneath it all, I felt the solid bedrock of the peace I had built for myself. To let her back in would be to invite the chaos, the drama, the endless emotional accounting. It would mean tearing down this beautiful, quiet house to make room for her wreckage. My love for my daughter didn't end. It just transformed into a deeper, more necessary love for myself. I held my finger over the screen, and with a quiet sense of finality, I pressed delete. The greatest lesson I learned is that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to stop watering a plant that has refused to grow. You have to save the water for your own garden. My payback wasn't the money, it was the peace. My revenge wasn't her misery, it was my own quiet, unshakable happiness. So, let me ask you, if you discovered the door to your own happiness was locked and the key was your own courage, would you be brave enough to turn it? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one. And for more stories about finding the strength to write your own chapter, don't forget to like and subscribe. They saw a quiet old woman in a house full of dusty, worthless books. They had no idea they were sitting in a library of ammunition, and I, the quiet librarian, was about to check it all out. After they left, the front door clicking shut with a terrible finality, the silence they left behind was different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet I was used to. It was a hollow, ringing silence, the kind that follows a verdict. For a long time, I just sat there on the sofa, my hands folded in my lap, tracing the floral pattern of the upholstery my late husband and I had picked out 30 years ago. I didn't cry. The capacity for tears felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. The shock had burned away the grief, leaving behind something cold, hard, and perfectly clear. They had drawn a line. They had appraised my life and found it valuable only as raw material for their own. I thought of Brenda's face, her eyes averted, unable to look at me as her husband demanded I dismantle my world for their convenience. She was a stranger to me now, a woman who looked like my daughter but who had none of her heart. Slowly, I stood up and walked into the kitchen. I filled the kettle, my movements precise and automatic. I spooned loose-leaf tea into my favorite porcelain pot. The familiar ritual, the scent of bergamot and steam, was a small anchor in the storm that had just torn through my life. As the water steeped, I looked out the window at my small backyard, at the bird feeder I refilled every morning. For years, my life had been about tending to things, about providing a safe home for Brenda, providing knowledge to my students, providing a constant, reliable source of love. That well of provision had just been declared public property, to be drained at will. But as I poured the tea, I realized something. They had made a librarian's cardinal mistake. They had judged a book by its cover. They saw a quiet, aging woman and assumed she was also weak. They saw a life of modest means and assumed it was a life without resources. They had no idea that my true wealth wasn't in a bank account, but on the shelves that lined every wall of my house. Leaving the tea untouched, I walked to the old oak desk in the corner of my living room. From the bottom drawer, I retrieved a worn, leather-bound address book. Its pages were soft as cloth, filled with entries written in my own hand over 50 years. This wasn't a book of neighbors or repairmen. It was a secret history of my other life, the one I lived in the margins of bake sales and PTA meetings. It held the private numbers of book dealers from London to San Francisco, of university archivists, of fellow collectors, a network of quiet scholars and obsessive hunters who spoke the same language I did. The language of provenance, of edition points, of the thrill of finding a treasure where no one else thought to look. My finger, wrinkled but steady, traced the faded ink until it landed on the name I needed, Dr. Alistair Finch, the Grolier Club, New York. Alistair was more than a friend. He was a peer, a world-renowned bibliophile who knew, perhaps better than anyone, what was really sitting on my shelves. I picked up the phone, the old landline, its weight solid and real in my hand. He answered on the second ring. "Finch, Alistair," I said, my voice even and calm. "It's Eleanor Vance." The gruffness in his voice melted. "Eleanor, my dear, what a pleasant surprise. Don't tell me you found another undiscovered Whitman manuscript in a barn somewhere." I allowed myself a small, thin smile. "Something like that. Alistair, I need a favor. I need an introduction to the head of American literature at Sotheby's." The line went silent for a moment. I could almost hear the gears turning in his brilliant mind. He knew what I had. We hadn't spoken of it in years, but he knew. "Good heavens, Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Are you finally cashing in your chips? The market has been waiting for a collection like yours for a decade. People don't think they exist anymore, not outside of institutions." "I'm not cashing in," I corrected him gently. "I'm liquidating. There's a difference. I'm funding a new venture." "Oh," he asked, his curiosity piqued. "And what might that be?" "Myself," I said simply. "I'm investing in myself." Another pause, this one filled with a deep, knowing respect. "Well, that is the best kind of investment there is," he said, his voice now brisk with purpose. "Consider it done. I'll call Julian personally. He'll be in touch before the end of the day. And Eleanor, Godspeed." After I hung up, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The decision was made. The first gear of a great, complex machine had been engaged. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking through my house, not with the sadness of leaving it, but with the focused eye of a curator. I ran my hand over the spines, my old friends. I pulled out a few key pieces. The pristine Poe that I'd outbid a smug dealer from Boston for in 1983. The Hawthorne with the rare printing error that I'd found in a box of junk at a church rummage sale. Finally, I pulled out my replacement copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. I held it in my hands, feeling its familiar weight. The book I had sacrificed for Brenda's future had, in a strange, cruel twist of fate, paved the road to this very moment. That money had cemented Todd's place in her life, and his influence had corroded her until nothing of the girl I knew was left. The irony was a bitter pill. One book was the price of her happiness. This entire library would be the price of mine. The phone rang late that afternoon. A crisp, professional voice introduced herself as Julianne Davies, the specialist Alistair had mentioned. She was already booked on a flight to Cleveland for the following morning. The machine was in motion. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. For a moment, I saw what they saw. A woman of 68, with graying hair and the lines of a quiet life etched around her eyes, a soft target. But then I looked closer, and I saw the glint of steel that had always been there, hidden behind the cardigans and the comfortable shoes. The quiet librarian was still there. But the woman who was about to greet the world was someone else entirely. She was the curator of the Eleanor Vance collection, and she was just getting started. The 3 weeks leading up to the auction were the busiest of my life. While professional movers, the kind who handle museum pieces, carefully packed my books for their trip to New York, I handled the packing of my own life. I sorted 40 years of memories into 3 piles: keep, donate, and discard. It was a surprisingly painless process. When you've been shown in no uncertain terms that you are no longer a cherished part of someone's future, it becomes much easier to let go of the past. I sold my house to a young couple whose excited chatter about nurseries and swing sets filled the empty rooms with a warmth they hadn't known in years. All the while, my phone would buzz with texts from Brenda. Links to houses on Zillow, each one bigger and grander than the last. Photos of kitchen islands and walk-in closets. They were so busy planning how to spend my future that they never once bothered to ask me about it. Their assumption of my compliance was the last gift they ever gave me. It gave me the space and silence I needed to dismantle their world without them ever noticing. On the morning of the auction, I sat in a crisp, anonymous hotel room overlooking downtown Cleveland. I had no desire to be in the grand auction hall in New York. This wasn't a spectator sport for me. It was business. At exactly 9 a.m., my email chimed. The subject line from Sotheby's read, "Your auction is now live. The Eleanor Vance collection." I clicked the link. It was a masterpiece of digital curation. My books, my beautiful beloved books, were presented like Hollywood stars, each with its own glossy photos and detailed history. And there, on the homepage, was a biography. It spoke of a discerning and quiet force in American literary collecting, a scholar with a preternatural eye for value. It was describing a woman I had always been, but that no one, least of all my own daughter, had ever bothered to see. With a perfectly steady hand, I forwarded the email link to Todd's corporate address. I added no subject of my own. I simply typed one sentence. "Todd, since you're a wealth advisor, I thought you might find this portfolio of illiquid assets interesting." I hit send. Then I turned off my phone, lay back on the crisp hotel pillows, and closed my eyes. I can picture the scene as if I were there. Todd, in his glass-walled office, projecting an air of unearned authority. He would see the email from me and open it with a sigh, expecting a question about capital gains tax on the house he thought I was selling for him. And then he would see it. The Sotheby's logo. My name, the words, the Eleanor Vance Collection. He would have squinted, confused, then he would have scrolled. He would have seen the photo of a pristine Moby Dick, the book he'd seen 100 times on my shelf, now next to the words, estimate, $80,000, $120,000. He would have seen the Poe, the Hawthorne, the Faulkner, a rolling tidal wave of value that defied comprehension. The polite hum of his office would have faded to a dull roar. His universe, which had been so orderly, so hierarchical with him at the top and me at the bottom, would have tilted on its axis. And then he would have seen the total estimated value of the collection, a number that would not only build his dream house, but buy the whole block. His call to Brenda would have been a strangled, incoherent squawk. I see her, annoyed, telling Theo it's time for his nap, picking up the phone with a sigh. Todd, I'm busy. The books, Brenda. The damn books. They're worth millions. Your mother, she sold you out. They would have sped to my house. Todd's expensive sedan eating up the miles. The first sign that their world had changed forever would have been the cheerful, professionally printed sold sign on my front lawn, a stake through the heart of their plans. Their key would have fit in the lock, but the house that opened to them would have been a stranger. Empty, silent. Their panicked calls of Mom would have been swallowed by the bare walls. They would have rushed to the living room, the heart of the home, and found it hollowed out. The shelves, my beautiful floor-to-ceiling shelves, were barren. Just pale, dust-free rectangles on the wallpaper, like ghosts of a treasure they had been too blind to see. I imagined them running from room to room, a frantic, desperate search, but it was all gone. Finally, on the gleaming, empty expanse of the kitchen counter, they would have seen it, a single, small cardboard box. Hope would have surged, a last, desperate thought that maybe, just maybe, this was it, papers, deeds, a check. Brenda's trembling hands would tear at the packing tape. Inside, her breath would catch. No fortune. Just the artifacts of a childhood she had discarded. Yearbooks, a dried corsage from her senior prom, a little clay handprint she'd made for me in kindergarten, and on top of it all, a single cream-colored card. Inside, a small silver key was taped. Below it, 2 sentences in my neatest script. Brenda, I have left you exactly what you have earned from me. The memories, everything else, I earned for myself. That would have been it. The final, quiet closing of the book. For Brenda, the tears would have come then, a storm of grief for a mother and a fortune she had lost in the very same moment. But for Todd, it would be something far colder, the pure, gut-wrenching terror of failure. He, the financial wizard, had stood in a gold mine and declared it a sandbox. His credibility, the very foundation of his fragile ego and his career, had been annihilated. Later that evening, in my quiet hotel room, I turned my phone back on. 17 missed calls, dozens of texts, a waterfall of shock, anger, and finally, pathetic pleading. I looked at the screen for a long moment. Then, I selected all, and I pressed delete. The screen went blank, and with that single tap, everything was gone. Not just the messages, but the crushing weight of expectation, the years of quiet disappointment, the feeling of being a footnote in my own daughter's life. It was all erased, leaving behind a clean, quiet space, a blank page. And for the first time in a very long time, I was the one holding the pen. My new story began not with a bang, but with the scent of salt water and jasmine. I left Cleveland behind, with its gray skies and its ghosts, and moved to a small sun-drenched house in Charleston, South Carolina. It was a city that had survived wars and fires and hurricanes, a city that wore its history with a quiet, unshakable grace. I felt at home there immediately. My house had a little walled garden where I could read, a wide piazza for catching the evening breeze, and tall 12-foot windows that let the light pour in, chasing the shadows from every corner. In the weeks that followed, I did something I hadn't done in years. I tended only to myself. I found a local bakery that sold bene wafers, thin and crispy, and tasting of sesame and salt. I learned the names of the egrets that fished in the marsh down the road. I joined the Historical Society, not to teach but to learn. I was no longer Mrs. Vance, the retired librarian, or Brenda's mother. I was just Eleanor, a woman with a curious mind and time to fill it. The first piece of furniture I bought was a single, elegant bookshelf. It stood empty for a month, a silent testament to my newfound freedom. Then, slowly, I began to fill it. Not with investment-grade first editions, but with dog-eared paperbacks from the local bookstore, modern poetry I didn't always understand, and biographies of brilliant, difficult women. This library wasn't for posterity or for profit. It was for pleasure. About 2 months after I had settled in, a letter arrived. The stationery was thick and cream-colored, the postmark from Beacon Hill in Boston. It was from Meredith, Todd's mother. I almost threw it in the trash, wanting no part of that world. But I opened it. Her perfect, slanted script was a stark contrast to the wreckage of the life she had helped create. It was not a plea, and it was not an excuse. It was, to my utter shock, an admission of defeat. "Dear Eleanor," it read, "I am writing to inform you that I have advised my son to begin divorce proceedings. A man who fails to see an empire in his own living room is not a man I trust to carry on my family's name. I, too, am guilty. I judged you by the quietness of your life and the modesty of your home. I saw a simple widow, and I failed to recognize a strategist of the highest order. You built your fortune in silence, and your victory was absolute. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I am writing only to offer my profound, unvarnished respect." I folded the letter. There was no joy in reading it, no thrill of victory. There was only the quiet, firm click of a final door swinging shut. The person whose respect I had never sought was the only one who truly understood what I had done. My new life was peaceful, but it was not without its ghosts. One evening, a video message arrived on my tablet. It was from Brenda. I steeled myself and pressed play. Her face filled the screen, no longer polished and perfect, but pale and tear-streaked. In her arms, a baby with wide, curious eyes, my grandson. "Mom," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He has your eyes. I see it now. Todd's gone," he said. "He said I was a bad investment." A bitter, broken laugh escaped her lips. He was right. "I invested in all the wrong things, Mom. I threw away the only real treasure I ever had. I threw you away. I'm so sorry." I looked at the face of my daughter, a woman I loved but no longer knew. I looked at the innocent face of my grandson, and I felt a wave of love and sorrow so deep it was a physical ache. But I knew, with the certainty of a survivor, that to open the door to her would be to let the storm back in. My love for her hadn't died, but it had finally been outweighed by a fierce, necessary love for myself. With a quiet breath, I held my finger over the screen, and I pressed delete. The greatest lesson I've learned is that your own happiness is not a luxury you earn after everyone else has been cared for. It is the foundation from which you live. My payback was never about the money. It was about reclaiming my own story, about becoming the author of my own final, peaceful chapters. So let me ask you, if life handed you a brand new, unwritten page, would you have the courage to turn to it? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the hardest of times. The silence in the house was the loudest sound they had ever heard. It was an aggressive, echoing silence that pushed in on them from the bare walls and the naked floors. The cheerful afternoon sun streaming through the windows only seemed to highlight the emptiness, illuminating dust motes dancing where a lifetime of furniture used to be. Every corner of the home that was supposed to be their golden goose, their ticket to a grander life, was now just a hollow monument to their own greed. Brenda stood motionless in the center of the living room, turning in a slow, disbelieving circle. The pale rectangles on the wallpaper where my books had stood for 50 years looked like freshly dug graves. "It's all gone," she whispered, the words swallowed by the vast emptiness. "Everything's gone." "No, no, no," Todd muttered, his voice a low, frantic hum. He wasn't looking at the walls. He was looking at the floorboards, the light fixtures, the fireplace mantel. His wealth advisor brain was in overdrive, frantically searching for a hidden asset, a secret compartment, a last-ditch clue. There has to be something. Papers, A safe deposit box key. Something. He began a desperate, clumsy search, yanking open built-in cabinet doors that had once held board games and photo albums, now revealing nothing but dust. He ran his hands along the fireplace bricks, his movements jerky and panicked. This wasn't the calm, cool financial guru he pretended to be. This was a desperate gambler who had just lost the house. While Todd tore through the empty rooms like a storm, Brenda drifted toward the kitchen, her movements slow and dreamlike. And there, in the dead center of the granite countertop that I had wiped down 10,000 times, was a single, small cardboard box. It was a plain brown moving box, sealed with a single strip of clear packing tape, with her name written on it in my neat, familiar script. "Todd," she called out, her voice a thin thread of hope. "Here, there's a box." He scrambled into the kitchen, his eyes wild. He saw the box and a wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over his face. "Okay," he breathed, straightening his tie, trying to reclaim some of his lost authority. "Okay. This is it. The will, the deeds, the account numbers." She wouldn't have just left us with nothing. They stood over the box like vultures. Brenda's hands trembled as she peeled back the tape. She lifted the flaps, her heart pounding with a desperate hope for stock certificates, for bearer bonds, for the tangible proof that her plan had worked. The first thing she saw was a flash of faded blue. A ribbon. She lifted it out. On the front, in faded gold lettering, it read, "Jefferson County Spelling Bee, 4th grade, 1st place." For a fleeting second, a memory might have surfaced of me drilling her on words at the kitchen table, of the ice cream cone we had afterward, of how proud I was. But the memory was useless. The ribbon was worthless. She dropped it on the counter. Next came a lump of clay, painted a lopsided blue and green, with the faint impression of a tiny hand in its center. The paperweight she'd made me for Mother's Day in kindergarten. It was followed by a brittle, yellowed corsage from her senior prom, its petals like dried insect wings. Then, her high school yearbooks. Todd shoved them aside impatiently. "Trinkets," he spat. "It's all worthless junk. Look underneath, Brenda. Look for an envelope." She dug deeper, her movements now frantic. Her fingers closed around a thick, cream-colored envelope. This was it. She tore it open. Inside there was no check, no legal document. There was only a simple greeting card. Taped to the inside was a small silver key. Below it, 2 sentences. My voice would have been in her head then, not as a memory, but as a final, clear judgment, reading the words I had so carefully chosen. "Brenda, I have left you exactly what you have earned from me. The memories." She stared at the words, reading them over and over, the meaning slowly seeping into the cracks of her shattered expectations. The key, she now understood, was for a storage unit a few miles away, a place where the rest of this worthless junk was waiting for her. "And everything else," my voice would have continued in her mind, "I earned for myself." She dropped the card as if it had burned her. The clay handprint, jostled by the movement, rolled to the edge of the counter and fell to the hardwood floor, shattering into a dozen pieces. The sound, a sharp, definitive crack, echoed through the silent house. It was the sound of a childhood breaking. It was the sound of a final, irreversible end. Brenda crumpled, sinking to the floor amidst the wreckage of her own past, her sobs finally coming harsh, ugly gasps of grief for a fortune she never really had and a mother she had just truly lost. But Todd didn't look at her. He stared at the shattered paperweight, his face a mask of cold, white fury. His loss wasn't just emotional, it was existential. He, Todd, the wealth advisor, the man whose entire identity was built on his supposed financial acumen, had been played. He had stood in a treasure chamber and valued its contents at nothing. The humiliation was a physical blow. He thought of his clients, his partners, his imperious mother-in-law. He wasn't just broke, he was a fool, a laughingstock. With a strangled roar, he grabbed his $1,000 smartphone and hurled it against the wall, where it exploded in a shower of glass and plastic. It was the desperate, impotent act of a man whose carefully constructed world had just been utterly and completely liquidated. They had come looking for an inheritance. They thought it was something to be claimed, a prize to be won. They never understood that the real inheritance, the love, the support, the endless sacrifices, was something they had been given freely every day of their lives. And because they had placed no value on it, in the end, It was the only thing they had left. They were left in the wreckage of their own making, surrounded by the worthless trinkets of a past they had never valued. I, on the other hand, was 3 states away, learning how to breathe again. The proceeds from the auction and the sale of my house felt less like money and more like a passport. It was a clean break, a ticket to a life I hadn't even allowed myself to dream of. I left Cleveland on a Tuesday, not even bothering to look back in the rearview mirror. I drove south, chasing a sun I hadn't realized I'd missed so desperately, until the gray skies of the Rust Belt gave way to the soft, hazy blue of the Carolina coast. I bought a small house in Charleston, a city that felt like it was built from stories. It was a single-story home, painted a pale, buttery yellow, with dark green shutters and a piazza that smelled perpetually of jasmine and salt. The air itself felt different here, thick and warm and full of life. Instead of the drone of traffic, I woke to the sound of church bells and the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages on cobblestone. It was a city that encouraged a slower pace, a more deliberate way of living. It suited the new woman I was becoming. For the first month, I did nothing but exist. I walked for hours, getting lost in the narrow, winding alleys, admiring the ironwork on the gates and the secret gardens tucked away behind historic walls. I found a small bakery that sold bene wafers, thin and sweet and nutty, and I would take a small bag down to the Battery to watch the sailboats glide across the harbor. I was a tourist in my own new life, and I was in no hurry to become a resident. The first piece of furniture I bought for the house was a single, tall bookshelf made of dark cherry wood. I had it placed in the sunniest room, and for weeks it stood completely empty. It was a statement to myself. I was no longer a curator. I was no longer the guardian of a fortune. I was simply a reader. Slowly, I began to fill it. I found a tiny, cluttered bookstore on King Street and spent afternoons browsing its shelves. I bought a worn paperback copy of a favorite novel, its pages soft with age. I bought a volume of Mary Oliver's poetry and read it aloud in my garden, the words feeling as natural and as beautiful as the blooming camellias around me. My new library was not a collection of assets. It was a collection of joys. I was thinking about my future, but for the first time, it was a future measured in pleasant afternoons and interesting books, not in compound interest or market value. I had started to build a small community. The ladies at the local historical society, a retired professor who walked his dog along the same route I did, the cheerful owner of the bakery. I was no longer just Brenda's mother, a title that had defined me for so long. I was Eleanor, the woman with the lovely garden, the one who could tell you the difference between a Georgian and a federal-style doorway. It was on one of these peaceful afternoons, about 2 months after my arrival, that the letter came. I was sitting on my piazza, a cool glass of sweet tea sweating on the small table beside me, when the mail carrier dropped a small stack of envelopes into my mailbox. Among the bills and the junk mail was a single, heavy envelope made of thick, cream-colored cardstock. The return address was an embossed crest I didn't recognize, with a street name in Beacon Hill, Boston. My heart gave a small, nervous flutter. It was a letter from another world, the world I had so carefully escaped. My first instinct was to tear it in half and toss it in the bin. I was fiercely protective of the peace I had built, but my curiosity, that old, familiar companion, wouldn't allow it. With a sigh, I slit the envelope open with my thumbnail. The handwriting inside was a perfect, elegant cursive, as sharp and as precise as the woman who had written it. It was from Meredith, Todd's mother. I steeled myself for a plea, an accusation, a demand, but it was none of those things. "Dear Eleanor," it began, "I am writing to inform you that I have advised my son to begin divorce proceedings. My family did not build its legacy by entrusting it to fools, and a man who fails to recognize an empire standing in plain sight is not a man I trust to carry on our name." I had to read the sentence twice. She wasn't defending him. She was cutting him loose. "I have had time to reflect," the letter continued, "on the events of the past few months. My complicity in them is not something I am proud of. I judged you by the quietness of your life and the modesty of your home. I saw a suburban widow, a relic to be managed, and I failed to recognize a strategist of the highest order. You built your fortune in silence, with a discipline and an intellect that my son, for all his bluster about portfolios, could never hope to comprehend. Your victory was absolute." The words didn't bring me a sense of triumph. They brought me a strange, quiet sense of sorrow for a woman so trapped in her own world of power and legacy that she could only see my life's passion through the lens of a financial victory. "I do not ask for your forgiveness, as I do not deserve it," the letter concluded. "I am writing only to offer my profound, unvarnished respect. You are a far more formidable woman than I ever imagined." I folded the letter and set it on the table. The war was truly over. An armistice had been signed by the one person I never expected to hear from again. The respect I had never asked for, from a woman I did not like, was the final, quiet confirmation that I had done the right thing. It was a period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. I picked up the letter again, slid it into the book I was reading, and closed the cover. It was just a bookmark now, a small, thin piece of a past that no longer had any power over me. It was just a bookmark now, a small, thin piece of a past that no longer had any power over me, and with that final page turned, I was truly free to start writing my own story. My new life in Charleston settled into a gentle, pleasing rhythm. The passing of time was no longer marked by holidays of obligation or birthdays of forced cheer, but by the blooming of the jasmine and the turning of the tides. The woman who had spent 40 years cataloging the lives and stories of others was finally curating her own. I named my new, small library the Charleston Collection. It was a quiet joke just for me. Its shelves held no first editions, no investment-grade assets. Its value was measured in cracked spines, in pages soft from rereading, in the pure, simple joy of a story well told. I made friends. Real friends, who were interested in my thoughts on a recent biography, not on my willingness to babysit. There was Margaret, a retired art history professor who could tell you the entire story of a piece of furniture just by the dovetailing on its joints. There was Samuel, a widower who had spent his life as a merchant marine and told stories of ports in Singapore and storms off the Cape of Good Hope. We were a collection of people who had lived full lives, and we met not out of duty or necessity, but out of a shared desire for good company. We were equals. It was a feeling so new to me, it felt like a revelation. I thought of Brenda and Todd less and less. They had become like characters in a book I had read a long time ago. I could remember the plot, but the sharp, painful emotions had faded, leaving only a distant academic sense of sadness. The peace I had cultivated was a fragile, beautiful thing, a garden I tended to with daily care. I protected it fiercely. It was on a warm Tuesday evening, as I was sitting on my piazza watching the fireflies begin to flicker in the twilight, that my past made one final attempt to breach the walls. A notification pinged on my tablet. It was a video message from an unknown number, but I knew, with a certainty that made the hairs on my arm stand up, who it was from. For a long moment, I simply stared at the little icon. My first instinct, my new, hard-won instinct for self-preservation, was to delete it without watching, to deny it entry, but I knew I couldn't. To ignore it would be to give it power, to admit that I was still afraid. The woman I was now was not afraid. She was a curator, and it was her job to assess every piece, even the broken ones, before deciding where they belonged. With a deep, steadying breath, I pressed play. Brenda's face filled the screen. It was a face I almost didn't recognize. The polished, confident mask she had worn for years was gone. Her skin was blotchy, her eyes were swollen and ringed with shadows, her hair was a tangled mess. She was in a dark room, and in her arms, sleeping fitfully, was my grandson Theodore. "Mom," she whispered, and her voice was a raw, broken thing. "He has your eyes. I look at him, and I see you. I never saw it before." She started to cry then. Not the performative tears I had seen in the past, but the ugly, wrenching sobs of a soul that has truly hit rock bottom. "Todd's gone." She managed to get out between gasps. "He left last week. He said I was a bad investment." A bitter, mirthless laugh tore from her throat. "Can you believe that? A bad investment." He was right. I invested in all the wrong things, Mom. In his parents' approval, in the right address, in the perfect-looking life. I stood in a room full of treasure, my whole life, and the only thing I saw was the dust. She shifted the camera to the sleeping baby. "And now this is all I have. He's all I have, and I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a mother, the only mother I ever really knew. I threw her away. I threw you away for nothing, and I am so, so sorry. I miss you." The video ended. The screen went dark. I sat there in the warm Charleston night, the sound of the cicadas, a deafening roar in the sudden silence. I looked at the dark screen, where the ghost of my daughter's face had been, where the image of my grandson's innocent, sleeping form was now burned into my mind, and I felt it. A wave of love so fierce and primal it almost brought me to my knees. A mother's love, the kind that wants to fix, to heal, to gather up the broken pieces and make them whole again. It would be so easy to call her. So easy to get in my car and drive north, to sweep in and save her from the wreckage she had made of her life. But then I looked around me. At the soft glow of the lamp in my living room, at the silhouette of the jasmine climbing the garden wall, at the peaceful, quiet, beautiful life I had built not out of spite, but out of the ashes of a life that had almost burned me to the ground. To let her back in her chaos and her need, would be to hand her a lit match. She would burn this new life down, too, not out of malice, but because that's what desperate, drowning people do. They pull you under with them. My love for the daughter I once had was real. My love for the grandson I might never know was real. But the love I had finally, painstakingly learned to have for myself had to be real too. And it had to be stronger. With a quiet breath that was half prayer, half farewell, I held my finger over the screen, and for the last time, I pressed delete. The greatest lesson my collection ever taught me is that the rarest treasures are the ones that give you peace. My payback wasn't the fortune I claimed, but the freedom it bought me. My revenge wasn't my daughter's pain, but my own quiet, unshakable happiness. I had to close the book on her story so that I could finally start writing my own. So let me ask you, if life handed you a brand new, unwritten page, would you have the courage to turn to it? If this story resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in the hardest of times.